wish to stop.
Bananas. You know what these are, and they are a great tasty fruit. In the past, the United States did multiple conflicts, wars and supported series of dictators, just to control the banana industry. Today, we will mention what happened in Guatemala. It's 1898, after America's victory over Spain. The United States was finally in a position to turn the Monroe Doctrine into a reality, and began its dominance over Central America. President Theodore Roosevelt had already publicly expressed his belief that the United States should be the main beneficiary of Central American production. This led to many interventions in the region. Some were armed and violent, as in Nicaragua and Haiti. Others were achieved under duress, such as the 1903 treaty with Cuba, a treaty that strongly benefited the United States over Cuba. But the case of Guatemala was different, because a series of dictators were willing to accommodate the economic interest of Americans in the nation, in exchange for receiving support for their brutal regimes. One of them was the regime led by Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who, without congressional support, allowed entry and awarded a multitude of contracts to a United States company called United Fruit Company. This company formed from the union of several of the largest fruit companies in the United States, and followed a vertical integration policy. They were determined to control every stage of the fruit production process. From the highways, railroads, and trains that they used to transport goods, to the houses where workers lived, and even the electricity that powered their cities. Eventually United Fruit came to control the telephone and telegraph facilities. They managed the only major port in the country, and even succeeded in monopolizing banana exports. And all of this, just to maximize their efficiency and profits. The situation worsened considerably under the regime of Jorge Ubico, Manuel Estrada's successor. Ubico was elected thanks to the support of Guatemala's elites, who sought to appease the workers' movements and protests that had arisen. As a consequence of the 1929 Great Depression, after Jorge came to power, he began taking action to oppress the working class. He replaced the existing debt peonage with that brutal vagrancy law that required all men of working age, that did not possess land to work 100 days for no pay. Ubico also passed a law that gave landowners complete immunity from any actions they may take, to protect their property. What this actually meant is that landowners could do whatever they wanted to their workers. This included immediate execution. Ubico also increased the police of 40 so that they could shoot or detain anyone who was being suspecting of violating these new working laws. Just like his predecessors, he continued to make massive concession to United Fruit Company, at the expense of Guatemala's own well-being. He gave them almost 500,000 acres of public land, for only the promise of building a port. Yes, that it. The United Food Company was already evicting smaller landowners, and taking their land to repurpose it for banana plantations. They were also given a tax exemption, and keep in mind that they owned the largest amount of land in Guatemala and the largest amount of workers. In 1944, the Guatemalan people finally decided they had endured enough. A revolution ended the tyrannical government, and finally allowed free elections to be held. Under the conservative president Juan José Arévalo, there were certain advances such as the creation of minimum wage, and the introduction of state plantations, but he also banned unions and small companies. Eventually union leaders did manage to force him to pass a few additional reforms, such as the prohibition of workplace discrimination, and the creation of health and safety standards for the workplace. But it was in 1950 that the situation became really interesting. Because the winner of those elections was a man called Jacobo Árbenz. Árbenz prepared a series of measures to improve the quality of life for Guatemalan, while limiting United Fruit's control over his country. He reinforced the union's right of workers, and passed a series of social reforms, one of the most important being the redistribution of territories, that United Fruit controlled but did not use. The government offered to pay United Fruit exactly the amount of money they had declared the land to be worth, $1,185,000. The United Fruit Company knew what was at stake. Andrew refused, claiming the land was actually closer to $20 million. Árbenz, of course, refused to pay this ridiculous amount, but he was not a communist or an anti-capitalist. To limit United Food's control over the nation, Árbenz built ports and highways to compete with their possessions. He also built a new hydroelectric plant to offer cheap electricity. This was a disaster for the United Fruit Company. Every penny the workers received was a penny they would not receive as profits. Every improvement in the workers' quality of life came at a cost to the company's profits. The United Fruit Company decided to visit the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. They began saying that a terrible communist leader had taken over Guatemala. Árbenz wasn't a communist though. Jacobo Árbenz explicitly defined his political and economic goals as capitalist, aiming to transform Guatemala from a feudal state into a modern, independent capitalist economy. Of course, at this time, the United States feared the domino effect. That is, if one country fell to a communism, so would the others. Guatemala leaders tried everything. They appealed to the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the international press, and even the United States itself, hoping that somehow reason could prevail. But it was all in vain. The American president had decided that Árbenz was a communist, and that he needed to be eliminated. The Guatemalan Foreign Ministry Guillermo Torriello lamented that the USA was categorizing as communism every manifestation of nationalism or economic independence, any desire for social progress, any intellectual curiosity, and any interest in progressive liberal reforms. Headquarters for the operations were established in Opalaca in Florida, on the outskirts of Miami. Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza lent this country out as an airstrip, and for hundreds of men, both Guatemala exiles and mercenaries from the U.S. and other Central American countries, to be trained. The training did not consist only in the use of weapons, but also in radio broadcasting and the art of sabotage and demolition. They also gathered Soviet-marked weapons to be planted inside Guatemala as evidence of Soviet intervention. Then came an intense propaganda campaign against Árbenz, as would become their standard practice when overthrowing governments in Latin America. The CIA used their influence over newspapers all over Latin America to have them print articles against Jacobo Árbenz to give the impression that rejection of his ideas were coming naturally. They also distributed 100,000 copies of a pamphlet called Chronology of Communism in Guatemala, as well as 20,000 anti-communist posters. The CIA also produced 3 movies that made communism look bad, and were played for free. On the 18th of June 1954, they decided that the time for the offensive had come. Planes dropped leaflets over Guatemala, demanding the immediate resignation of Árbenz, threatening to bomb the country if he refused. As promised, over the weekend, USA airplanes bombed ports, fuel tanks, ammunition reserves, military barracks, the international airport, and even a school. So intense was the terror campaign, that the American embassy put loudspeakers on the embassy's roof, and played the sounds of exploding bombs, in order to increase the anxiety of the capital's residents. When Árbenz tried to make a public speech on the radio to calm down their population, the transmission was blocked by the CIA. Then, the CIA's army crossed into Guatemala from Honduras, and managed to capture a few towns before being stopped by the Guatemalan army. This army was outmatched against Guatemala army. To counter this, they used psychological warfare. They broadcast messages, declaring that Guatemala was being attacked from all sides. According to these messages, that were made to appear as official, and were even transmitted through official military channels, the Guatemalan army was being rapidly defeated. Paratroopers had allegedly infiltrated Guatemala City, and completely surrounded the positions of the offenders. The agency went as far as to drop dummy parachutes in scattered areas to heighten the belief that a major invasion was taking place. The United Fruit Company, of course, also did their part. They circulated photographs to journalists of mass graves of dead bodies, as supposed evidence of the atrocities committed by the Árbenz regime. A few years later, Thomas McCann, who was in charge of the operation, admitted that even he did not know where the photos came from. They could perfectly well have been victims of either of the two sides, or of an earthquake. One of the biggest battles would happen at Chiquimula, a strategic town near the Honduran border, became a key target because controlling it would allow the rebels to secure supply lines, and demonstrate momentum against Árbenz's government. The battle itself involved a mix of irregular guerrilla tactics by the rebels and defensive measures by government troops. Despite Árbenz's forces initially putting up resistance, the rebels captured Chiquimula with relatively low casualties due to weak coordination and declining morale in the government army. Árbenz's government desperately pleaded for a solution to the conflict before the United Nations. However, the vote was blocked by the United States. The Americans then offered money to Guatemalan officers to switch sides, offering up to $60,000 to each. With mounting pressure, Árbenz was forced to resign, and despite all the rumors that Guatemala was a Soviet base of operations, no communists came to their aid. Castillo Armas would be the new president of Guatemala, and he was a brutal dictator. He began implementing laws to imprison people, even if there was no evidence of them being communist, without trials. Thousands were executed on the spot. This would eventually lead up to the devastating 30 years Guatemala Civil War. The United Fruit Company will go through tough times because, well, the world saw just how much of an evil company they truly were. Eventually, they would rebrand, and today they're known as Chiquita. It's important to learn about these events so they never repeat themselves.